It wasn't the good kind of tired, the one you earn from a long day of hiking or hard, satisfying work. This was a thin, shaky tiredness. It was a fog that sat behind her eyes and a static that hummed in the back of her mind, even when everything was quiet. And right now, everything was quiet. The world outside her window was a deep navy blue, punctuated only by the single bright eye of a street lamp. Inside her room, the only light came from the numbers on her bedside clock. 11:37 p.m. They glowed a relentless electric red. She had turned off her phone an hour ago, determined to give her brain a real chance to shut down. But her brain, it seemed, had other plans. She lay on her back, the weight of her body sinking into the mattress. Her blanket was soft, the pillow was cool against her cheek, but none of it mattered, because above her, stretching from one side of the room to the other, was her own personal, frustrating universe, the ceiling. In the darkness, it wasn't just a flat white surface. It was a canvas for her anxiety. Her eyes, adjusted to the lack of light, would trace the faint, invisible lines and textures. That small crack near the light fixture became the main road on a map of all the things she had to do tomorrow. That faint, bumpy patch of texture transformed into the angry face of her boss from a meeting 2 weeks ago, a conversation she was still replaying and regretting. "Why did I say it like that?" she whispered into the stillness. The thought was a spark, and it lit a fuse. Suddenly, a silent fireworks display of worries exploded across the ceiling. Did I remember to send that email to Sarah? A little shimmering worry bubble appeared near the door. I think I left the kitchen light on. A faint glowing line stretched from the wall. What was that weird noise the car made this afternoon? How much will a repair cost? A dark, stormy cloud formed right above her head, feeling heavy and real. This was the ritual. The to-do list of doom, as she had secretly named it. It was a list written in light and shadow, and she was its only audience. Night after night after night. She tried the tricks. Oh, she knew all the tricks. She tried counting sheep, but the sheep kept morphing into unpaid bills and needed a dentist appointment. She tried taking deep, slow breaths, but her mind would interrupt on the exhale. You're not doing it right. You're still awake, see? You're a failure at sleeping. The clock glowed, 12:26 a.m. A deep sigh escaped her lips. This was the worst part, the feeling of time slipping away. Each minute that clicked by on that red clock was a minute of precious lost rest. It was a countdown to another groggy morning, another day of drinking too much coffee, another evening of feeling drained before it even began. She felt like she was trapped in a cycle, a wheel she couldn't step off. She remembered a time years ago when sleep wasn't a battle. It was a gentle tide that would just come. She would lie down, and the next thing she knew, it was morning. When did it stop? Was it in college during finals? Or when she started her first real job with its new responsibilities? She couldn't pinpoint the moment. It was like a thief had slowly, quietly, stolen her ability to rest, and she only noticed once it was long gone. Her eyes scanned the ceiling again. Tonight, the main feature was a presentation she had to give at work in 3 days. On the ceiling, she could see the PowerPoint slides, floating in the dark. She saw the faces of her colleagues, their expressions blank and judgmental. She felt her own throat go dry, just thinking about it. Frustrated, she rolled onto her side, pulling the blanket over her head. This created a little dark cave, but it didn't help. Now the worries were just closer, buzzing in her ears like mosquitoes. The heat of her own breath under the blanket felt suffocating. She flipped onto her other side, facing the window. The street lamp's light created long, strange shadows across the floor. One shadow looked like a reaching hand. She squeezed her eyes shut. Please, she thought, a desperate, silent plea to no one in particular. Please just let me sleep. But the silence in the room was a loud kind of silence. It was filled with the hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the occasional swish of a car on a distant road, and the relentless, pounding rhythm of her own heartbeat in her ears. It was a concert of loneliness and wakefulness. She thought about getting up, maybe reading a book. But the light from a lamp would feel like an admission of defeat, and it would surely wake her up even more. Maybe a glass of warm milk? That always seemed like something from an old movie, not real life. The clock now read 1:15 a.m. A wave of hopelessness washed over her. This was it. This was another one of those nights. The kind where you eventually give up and just accept that you will be a zombie tomorrow. The kind where you start to believe you might never have a truly good night's sleep again. She felt a single hot tear escape from the corner of her eye and trace a path down her temple into her hair. It wasn't just about being tired. It was about the loss of control. Her body was exhausted, her eyes felt gritty, but her mind was a runaway train, hurtling through a dark tunnel of past regrets and future fears with no brakes. She rolled onto her back again, surrendering to the ceiling galaxy. The presentation worries were now mixing with a forgotten memory from 7th grade, when she had tripped in the cafeteria. Why was her brain doing this to her? It felt like a form of self-torture. In a last, desperate attempt to find something, anything else to focus on, her hand fumbled on the nightstand. Her fingers brushed against her phone. The screen was dark and cool. For a moment, she hesitated. She knew the blue light was bad. She knew it would stimulate her brain. But the silence and the darkness and the ceiling were winning. She needed a distraction, a different kind of noise to drown out the one in her head. She tapped the screen. It lit up too bright, making her squint. She quickly turned the brightness all the way down. She opened a podcast app, scrolling aimlessly through the lists. True crime. No, that would definitely not help. Comedy? Sometimes it worked, but sometimes laughing would wake her up even more. She scrolled further. News? Absolutely not. Then her thumb paused. She saw a category she usually skipped. Science and nature. She clicked on it. The titles were mostly about black holes, quantum physics, and the lives of octopuses. It all seemed too complicated for her tired brain, but then she saw one. The title was simple, and the host's name sounded gentle. The episode was called The Slow Dance of Our Planet. The description read, "A look at how the very ground beneath our feet is constantly, imperceptibly on the move." Something about the word imperceptibly felt calming. Her own problems were so perceptible, so loud and in her face. The idea of something huge happening too slowly to ever notice. It was intriguing. She plugged in her earbuds, lay back down on the pillow, and pressed play. A man's voice, warm and steady, filled her ears. "Think about the Atlantic Ocean," he began. "It seems like a permanent, unchanging barrier between continents. But did you know it's getting wider? Every year, the distance between North America and Europe increases by about 1 inch. Roughly the same speed that your fingernails grow." Alara's eyebrows lifted slightly in the dark. She looked at her own fingernails. She tried to imagine an entire ocean with all its storms and whales and massive ships, slowly, patiently, stretching itself wider at that gentle, unhurried pace. The image was so strange, so peaceful. Her presentation was still on the ceiling, but it seemed a little smaller now. A little less important. The frantic rhythm of her thoughts began to slow, just for a moment, to match this new, slower rhythm being described to her. She didn't know it yet, lying there in the dark. But she had just taken the first, small step off the exhausting wheel. She had found a crack in the wall of her insomnia, and through it, she could hear the first faint whisper of a much larger, much calmer world. The voice from the podcast faded out, replaced by a soft instrumental melody that signaled the end of the episode. Alara lay perfectly still, the silence of her room feeling different now. It wasn't the loud, anxious silence from before. It was a thoughtful, full silence. For the first time in hours, her mind wasn't a frantic pinball machine of worries. It was occupied by a single, strange, and beautiful image, the entire Atlantic Ocean, a vast and powerful body of water, patiently widening itself at the speed of a growing fingernail. She replayed the host's words in her head. The forces that move continents are unimaginably powerful, yet they work on a timescale that is almost peaceful. A human life is too short to perceive their motion. A human life is too short, the thought echoed. All the things she worried about, the presentation, the email she might have forgotten, the weird noise from her car, they all existed within the tiny, frantic bubble of her own human life. But the Earth operated on a different clock, a slower, grander, more patient clock. She pulled the earbuds out. The red numbers of the clock glared at her, 1:48 a.m., but the usual panic didn't come. Instead, a tiny, fragile idea began to form in the quiet space the podcast had created. It was a crazy idea, but in her state of exhausted desperation, it felt like a lifeline. What if the weight of her anxieties was no match for the weight of geologic time? It was a desperate hypothesis, a scientific guess born from sleeplessness. She thought of it like an equation. On one side, there was her racing mind, a whirlwind of what-ifs and should-haves. It felt massive and overwhelming to her. On the other side, there was the fact that the ground beneath her apartment building was part of a colossal plate, slowly drifting on a sea of molten rock. That was actually massive, maybe, just maybe. If she could focus on the truly massive, slow things, her own massive feeling problems would shrink back down to their actual, manageable size. This wasn't about positive thinking. She had tried that. Telling herself, "Don't worry, it will be fine," never worked, because her mind would immediately counter with, "But what if it's not fine?" This was different. This wasn't about convincing herself her problems were small. It was about reminding herself that the world was immeasurably, comfortingly large and old. She decided to test her hypothesis. Right there and then, she closed her eyes, trying to push away the image of her work presentation. It was like trying to shove a beach ball underwater. It kept popping back up. So she didn't fight it. She let the presentation be there, and then she gently placed the image of the drifting continents right next to it. She pictured a map of the world, not like the static one from her school classroom, but a living, breathing one. She imagined North America and Europe as two slow, sleepy giants, turning their backs on each other and inching apart year after year, century after century. She focused on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, an underwater mountain range she'd just learned about, where new rock was constantly bubbling up from the Earth's hot interior, patiently pushing the continents further apart. The presentation was about 15 slides. The Atlantic Ocean was thousands of miles wide. The presentation would be over in 20 minutes. The Atlantic had been widening for millions of years. A long, slow breath escaped her lips, one she felt like she'd been holding all night. The tight knot of tension between her shoulder blades seemed to loosen, just a little. This is working, she thought, a spark of wonder cutting through her exhaustion. It wasn't magic. She was still awake. But the frantic, screaming quality of her anxiety had been dialed down to a murmur. She remembered another fact from the podcast about the Himalayas. They were created by India, once a separate island, smashing into the underbelly of Asia. The host said the collision was still happening today, the mountains still rising millimeter by millimeter, as India continued its slow northward journey. She tried to imagine the force required to push up the tallest mountains on the planet. It was a force that could crumple the very crust of the earth, and it was happening right now, as she lay in her bed. But it was happening so slowly that it was silent, invisible, patient. There were no deadlines in the formation of a mountain range. No rushed meetings, no panicked late-night preparations. Just slow, steady, powerful growth. A memory surfaced, unbidden. She was a little girl, maybe 7 or 8, lying in the grass in her grandparents' backyard. She would stare up at the clouds, watching them change shape. She wasn't worried about anything then. She was just watching the sky, feeling the sun on her skin, completely absorbed in the slow, silent show above her. This feeling, this new experiment, reminded her of that. It was a return to a kind of childhood wonder, but for adults. It was looking at the clouds. But for the planet itself, her hypothesis, it seemed, had some merit. The clock now read 2:23 a.m. She was still awake, but she didn't feel the same crushing hopelessness. She felt curious. What other slow, giant secrets was the Earth keeping? What other calm, steady rhythms were humming along beneath the surface of her frantic life? She knew she needed to find more. This wasn't just a one-time trick. This felt like discovering a hidden door in a room she'd been trapped in for years. She didn't know where it led, but she knew she had to open it. She made a decision. Tomorrow she would go to the library during her lunch break. She would look for books, not dense, complicated textbooks, but simple books with pictures and clear explanations. Books about rocks, about oceans, about the sky. She was no longer just a woman trying to fall asleep. She was an explorer. Her territory was her own mind, and her map was going to be made of the oldest, calmest facts she could find. As she finally felt the heavy pull of sleep beginning to tug at the edges of her consciousness, her last conscious thought was a simple one. It wasn't about work or emails or car repairs. It was a question, a quiet promise she made to herself. What other lullabies does the earth have to sing? The morning sun felt different. It wasn't the harsh, accusing light Alara was used to, the one that seemed to highlight her exhaustion. Today it was just light. She had managed a few hours of solid sleep, a deep, dreamless rest that felt like a gift. The gritty feeling behind her eyes was gone. replaced by a fragile sense of clarity. Her hypothesis had worked. Not perfectly, but it had worked. The idea of the slow-moving Earth had been a life raft in her stormy mind. Now sitting at her desk at work, the familiar anxieties were starting to creep back in. The presentation was tomorrow. Her computer screen was a mosaic of open windows and unfinished tasks. The phone on her desk rang, and she felt her shoulders tense up. The modern world was demanding her attention, loudly and all at once, but today she had a plan. At exactly 12:05 p.m. she grabbed her bag and her jacket. "Just going for a walk," she said to her co-worker, and she stepped out into the bright, slightly chilly day. The public library was a grand, old building made of sandstone, its steps worn smooth by generations of feet. Pushing through the heavy doors felt like entering a sanctuary. The air inside was cool and carried that specific quiet smell of old paper and polished wood. The frantic noise of the city was instantly muffled. She felt a little silly. What was she even looking for? Books to help me sleep? That sounded ridiculous. She walked past the fiction section, her shoes making soft clicks on the tiled floor, and found her way to the nonfiction stacks. The signs above the aisles loomed: philosophy, history, travel. Then she saw it: geology. The aisle was quiet and narrow. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books. Many of them looked intimidating, with complex titles and dense text. She was about to give up when a splash of color caught her eye. On the bottom shelf was a large, almost square book with a worn cover. The title was simple: Earth, A Visual Journey. She pulled it out. It was heavy. She found a small wooden table tucked into a corner by a window and sat down. Sunlight streamed in, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She opened the book. The pages were thick and glossy, filled with breathtaking photographs, vast canyons, glittering crystals, volcanoes erupting in plumes of orange and gray. She started flipping through, not looking for anything in particular, just enjoying the pictures. Then a diagram stopped her. It was a simple, circular drawing with 3 sections. The title read, The Rock Cycle. She remembered learning about this in school a lifetime ago. It had been a boring list of facts to memorize for a test. But now, looking at it with her new, desperate curiosity, it didn't seem boring at all. It seemed like a story. A very, very long story. She began to read. It told her that a rock wasn't just a static, dead thing. It was a traveler on an endless journey. It started with fire. Molten rock, called magma, deep within the earth, would cool and harden. This created igneous rock, like granite. She looked at a photograph of a granite cliff face, speckled and strong. This was the beginning, but the story didn't end there. The book explained that wind, rain, and ice would slowly, over thousands of years, break down that granite cliff. Tiny pieces would wash away, becoming sand and silt. These tiny particles would travel down rivers and eventually settle at the bottom of a lake or an ocean. Layer upon layer, year after year, these sediments would pile up. The weight of the upper layers would press down on the lower layers, squeezing the water out and cementing them together. This created sedimentary rock, like sandstone, the very sandstone she realized that this library was built from. She looked up from the book and placed her hand flat on the cool wooden table. Was the wood, once a tree, part of a cycle too? Everything was connected in these vast, slow loops. She read on. The journey continued. If those sedimentary rocks were buried even deeper, pushed down by the movement of the Earth's plates, the incredible heat and pressure would change them. They wouldn't melt, but they would transform, like a caterpillar in a cocoon. They would become metamorphic rock, like marble or slate. The book showed a picture of a beautiful swirling piece of gneiss, its bands of color looking like a painting. It was a rock that had been through something, and had come out changed, beautiful in a new way, and the cycle wasn't finished. If that metamorphic rock was pushed down even further, it could melt, becoming magma once again, ready to start the whole journey over. Alara sat back in her chair, stunned. This wasn't just science. This was a philosophy. This was a lesson in patience and renewal. She thought about her own life, her own struggles. A bad day felt like a permanent state. A failure felt like a final verdict. A heartbreak felt like a crack that would never heal. But the rocks told a different story. They showed that everything changes. Nothing is permanent. A mountain is worn down to sand. That sand is carried to the sea and becomes a new stone. That stone is buried and transformed by pressure into something beautiful. And eventually, it all begins again. the pressure she felt at work, the heat of her anxiety. According to the rock cycle, these weren't just things to be suffered. They were forces of transformation. They were what changed you, what made you stronger, what turned you into something new. Not instantly, not easily, but slowly and surely, just like the earth. A wave of calm so profound it felt physical washed over her. It was the same feeling she'd had last night, but deeper and more solid. This wasn't just a distracting fact. It was a framework for understanding the world. She looked at the clock on the library wall. Her lunch hour was long over. She had been sitting there for almost 90 minutes, completely lost in a book about rocks. A small smile touched her lips. She didn't feel guilty, she felt enriched. She checked out the book, holding the heavy weight of it in her arms like a treasure. That night, as she got ready for bed, she didn't feel the usual dread. She placed the book on her nightstand. When she lay down and turned off the light, the ceiling didn't instantly become a screen for her worries. Instead, she closed her eyes and pictured the rock cycle. She imagined a river, carrying tiny grains of sand from a mountain she had never seen. She pictured those grains settling at the bottom of a dark, quiet ocean, piling up, layer upon layer, for centuries. There was no rush. There was no deadline. There was only the slow, constant, reassuring process of change. Her breathing slowed, matching this slow, imagined rhythm. The presentation tomorrow was just a layer of sediment. It would settle. It would pass. It was part of her own cycle. She was still awake, but she was no longer fighting it. She was just being, a small temporary part of a very old, very patient, and endlessly renewing world. And for now, that was more than enough. The morning of the presentation arrived. Ilara woke up before her alarm, a nervous flutter already alive in her stomach. It was there, that familiar tightness in her chest, the dry feeling in her mouth. For a moment, the old panic tried to take over. What if I forget my words? What if the data is wrong? What if they ask a question I can't answer? She sat up in bed and took a deep breath. Sunlight was streaming through the gap in her curtains. On her nightstand, the heavy library book sat, a silent reminder. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she closed her eyes and reached for the feeling it had given her. She thought about the rock cycle, the patient, endless transformation. It helped, but today, she needed something even bigger. She needed a sense of movement, of a journey so vast it made her own seem small. And then she remembered the first fact, the one that had started it all, the drifting continents. While she brushed her teeth, she didn't stare at her anxious reflection. Instead, she pictured a globe. Not a plastic ball on a stand, but the real, living Earth from the book. She imagined she could see right through the blue oceans to the ocean floor. She focused on the mid-Atlantic ridge, that long, underwater mountain chain she had read about. In her mind's eye, it wasn't just a line on a map. It was a seam, a place where the planet itself was being unzipped. She imagined magma, hot and glowing, bubbling up from the Earth's mantle, pushing its way out and cooling instantly in the cold, deep sea water to form new, fresh crust. With every slow, pulsing beat of the Earth's heart, North America and Europe were being pushed a tiny, tiny bit further apart. The distance she had to travel today was just her commute to the office. The continents had to travel thousands of miles. Her presentation would last 20 minutes. This dance of the continents had been going on for over 100 million years. A strange calm began to settle over her. The nervous energy was still there, but it was no longer a screaming panic. It was just energy. She could use this. On the bus to work, crammed between strangers, the old feelings tried to come back. The stuffy air, the jostling, the thought of the crowded conference room, it made her feel claustrophobic. She felt trapped, so she looked out the window. She looked past the other buildings, and she imagined the ground deep beneath the asphalt and the subway tunnels. She pictured the massive tectonic plate that her entire city was sitting on, the North American plate, and she imagined it, not as a static thing, but as a gigantic, slow-moving raft, drifting ever so slowly to the west. The bus was stuck in traffic, but the continent she was on was still moving. It was an incredible thought. No traffic jam could stop it. No meeting schedule could hurry it along. It moved at its own stately, unstoppable pace. She thought about the other side of the world. The book had a stunning picture of the Himalayas, jagged and majestic, piercing the clouds. Those mountains, the highest on Earth, were not always there. They were the result of a collision, The Indian subcontinent, once a separate landmass, had been drifting north for tens of millions of years. It was a slow-motion car crash of continents. And it was still happening. India was still pushing into Asia, and the Himalayas were still rising, millimeter by millimeter, year by year. The forces that built the tallest mountains on the planet were at work right now, as her bus inched forward. The pressure she felt about her presentation was nothing compared to the pressure that was crumpling the crust of the Earth itself. And that geologic pressure was happening in utter silence, with infinite patience. When she walked into the office, the pre-meeting buzz was already in the air. Her co-worker Mark gave her a tense smile. "Ready for the big show?" he asked, his voice tight. A week ago, that question would have sent a jolt of fear through her. Today, Alara just smiled back, a genuine, calm smile. "As ready as I can be," she said, and she meant it. She set up her laptop in the conference room. People filed in, their faces neutral or distracted. The head of the department, Mr. Davison, sat at the far end of the table, his arms crossed. This was the moment she usually dreaded the most. But as she stood up to walk to the front of the room, she had one last thought. She pictured Pangaea, the ancient supercontinent. She saw it not as a failed state, but as a single moment in a long, beautiful dance. The continents had been together, and then they had drifted apart, creating new oceans, new climates, new opportunities for life. Change was not a disaster. It was the engine of the planet. She clicked the first slide onto the screen. She took a breath, not a shaky, desperate one, but a deep, steadying one. She imagined the breath was as slow as the movement of the continents. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice clear and steady. "Today I'd like to walk you through the new quarterly projections." She talked. She explained the charts. She answered questions. She didn't feel like a performer under a spotlight. She felt like a continent, moving steadily through her material. There were a couple of tough questions, moments that would have made her stammer before. But when they came, she just paused. She didn't see them as attacks. She saw them as small, manageable pressures, the kind that, over time, could actually help you grow stronger, like the forces that build mountains. The presentation ended. There was a round of nods, a few thank yous. Mr. Davison gave a curt, "Good work, Alara." It was over. Back at her desk. The relief was sweet. But it was mixed with something else, a deep, quiet confidence. She hadn't just survived the presentation. She had navigated it with a peace she hadn't thought possible. That night, as she lay in bed, she didn't need to actively fight her thoughts. The memory of the day felt light. She had faced her mountain, and she had climbed it. But more importantly, she had learned that she could be like the earth itself, steady, patient, and resilient, moving through life at her own unshakable pace, one slow, deep breath at a time. The dance of the continents was her dance too. The success of the presentation left Alara with a new kind of energy. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of control. Her earth science method wasn't just a theory anymore. It was a tool she had used in the real world, and it had worked. But life, as she was learning, isn't a straight line of progress. It's a cycle, just like the rocks. A few days later, a different kind of challenge rolled in. It started with the sky. In the late afternoon, as she was finishing up at work, she noticed the light outside her window had turned a strange, bruised yellow. The air felt thick and heavy. A weather alert popped up on her phone. Severe thunderstorm warning. For most people, this might be a minor inconvenience. For Alara, it triggered a deep, old anxiety. She hated thunderstorms. Ever since she was a child, the sudden crack of thunder felt like the world was splitting apart. The howling wind sounded like chaos itself. It was a complete loss of control, a violent reminder of how small and fragile she was. Her usual commute home was a quiet bus ride. Today it was a race against the storm. The wind picked up, whipping dust and leaves into frantic spirals. By the time she got off at her stop, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, cold and sharp on her skin. She half ran the last block to her apartment building, her heart already starting to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She got inside just as the sky opened up. Rain lashed against the windows in solid sheets. A flash of lightning, impossibly bright, lit up her entire living room, followed a few seconds later by a deep, grumbling roar of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Alara stood in the middle of her living room, hugging herself. The old, familiar fear was rising in her throat. She felt that childlike urge to hide in a closet, to bury her head under a pillow until it was all over. This is it, part of her thought. This is where your little experiment fails. You can't reason with a storm. She walked to the window and looked out. The world was a blur of gray and green. Trees were bending in the wind. Another flash of lightning, this one so close the thunder was almost instantaneous. A sharp, deafening crack that made her jump back. Her breath was coming in short, shallow gasps. This was the opposite of slow continents and patient rocks. This was raw, immediate, and terrifyingly powerful. But then, a new thought, fragile as a seedling, pushed its way through the fear. It was a memory from the library book, from a chapter she had only skimmed about weather. What was it? She asked herself, pressing her forehead against the cool glass of the window. What did it say about storms? She closed her eyes, trying to picture the page, to push past the noise of the storm and the panic in her chest. And then it came to her. The book had said that a thunderstorm is just the Earth's way of balancing its energy. When the air in one place gets too warm and wet, and the air in another place is too cool and dry, the atmosphere works to correct the imbalance. It was a release, like letting out a long-held breath. And then she remembered the most important fact, the one that changed everything. The book had a small, almost throwaway sentence. At any given moment, there are approximately 2,000 thunderstorms happening across the Earth. 2,000. The number echoed in her mind, drowning out the sound of the wind for a second. 2,000. The phenomenon that felt so personal, so directed at her little apartment, so uniquely violent and world-ending, was happening in 2,000 other places around the globe, right now. It was as common as the sun rising. It was routine for the planet. She wasn't experiencing the one great storm. She was experiencing one of many, many daily storms. It was mundane. It was normal. This thought was a lifeline. She held onto it tightly. She walked to her sofa, sat down, and pulled a blanket over her legs. She decided to do something she had never done before. She decided to just watch the storm, not as a victim, but as an observer. Another flash of lightning. This time, instead of flinching, she watched it. She saw the brilliant branching vein of light tear across the dark sky. It wasn't just scary. It was also breathtakingly beautiful. It was a display of unimaginable power. The thunder rumbled deep and long. She listened to it. It wasn't just a noise that made her jump. It was the sound of the air itself being torn apart by that incredible heat. It was the sound of the atmosphere settling its accounts. She thought about those other 1999 storms. Some would be out over the vast, empty ocean seen only by satellites and passing birds. Some would be drifting over deserts, raining on sand that would quickly drink the water. Some would be hovering over tropical rainforests, where the plants and animals were so used to them, they were part of the rhythm of life. Her storm was just one note in a global, planetary symphony of energy exchange. The wind howled. But now it sounded less like a monster and more like a force, a powerful natural force, like the ocean currents or the continental drift, just happening on a faster, more dramatic timescale. She took a deep, slow breath, imagining she was breathing in the same way the planet breathed through its weather, releasing pressure, finding balance. The storm raged on, but something inside Alara had quieted. The tight knot of fear in her stomach had loosened. She felt small, but in a good way. She was a single person, in a single apartment, watching a single common storm. She was part of a much larger system, and the system was just doing its job. After a while, the rain began to soften from a frantic drumming to a steady, soothing patter. The thunder moved away, its grumbles growing more distant and less threatening. The worst was over. Alara sat on the sofa for a long time, just listening to the gentle rain. She felt a deep, profound peace. She had faced one of her oldest fears, not by fighting it, but by understanding her place in relation to it. The storm hadn't been an attack. It had been a gift. It had taught her that even the most chaotic and frightening events are part of the Earth's calm, steady rhythm. And if the planet could handle 2,000 storms at once without any fuss, then she could probably handle one. The peace Alara found after the storm stayed with her for days. It was a quiet confidence that felt different from the high of her successful presentation. That had been a victory over a specific external challenge. This was something deeper, a sense of acceptance that had settled into her bones. The world felt less like an opponent and more like a vast, sometimes dramatic, but ultimately stable home. One evening, she was visiting her parents for a weekly dinner. Her mother, while clearing the plates, had sighed and said, "I just don't know where the time goes. It feels like yesterday you were starting high school and now look at you." It was a common thing for parents to say, but that night, it stuck with Ilara on her drive home. Where does the time go? Her own life often felt like it was rushing past, a blur of work weeks, weekends, and monthly bills. She was constantly feeling behind, like she wasn't achieving enough fast enough. The pressure of her own personal timeline was a constant low-grade hum of anxiety. That night, as she got into bed, this feeling was particularly strong. She was thinking about a friend from college who had just gotten a big promotion. She thought about another friend who was buying a house. She scrolled through social media for a few minutes, which was always a mistake, and saw a curated highlight reel of vacations, engagements, and professional achievements. The familiar, itchy feeling of not being enough, of not doing enough, started to creep in. "I should be further along by now," the voice in her head whispered. "I'm wasting time." She put her phone down and turned off the light, but the thoughts kept circling. Her personal rock cycle felt stuck. Her continental drift felt too slow. Compared to everyone else, she was just standing still. Frustrated, she reached for the heavy library book on her nightstand. She flicked on her reading lamp, the soft glow pushing back the darkness. She wasn't looking for anything specific, just comfort. She flipped past the sections on rocks and weather, and her eyes landed on a chapter she had been avoiding. It was called A History of Earth, the Geologic Time Scale. It looked complicated. There was a large, colorful diagram that looked like a layered bar chart, with strange names like Precambrian and Jurassic and Cenozoic. It seemed daunting. But the feeling of being behind in life was worse. She started to read. The book explained that the Earth is approximately 4.6 billion years old. Ilara tried to picture that number. A billion was 1,000 millions. It was impossible to really feel, so the book offered a different way to think about it. It asked the reader to imagine the entire history of the Earth compressed into a single calendar year. Intrigued, she read on. In this one-year calendar, January 1st represents the moment the Earth formed from a cloud of dust and gas. The first simple, single-celled life wouldn't appear until around March. For months and months, the planet was just a swirling mass of water and rock, slowly cooling, slowly changing. The age of the dinosaurs, those colossal creatures that seemed to rule the ancient world, didn't begin until the middle of December. They thrived, and then they were gone, wiped out by an asteroid on the day after Christmas. And humans? Where did we come in? She followed the timeline with her finger. The first ape-like ancestors of humans appeared only very, very recently on this scale. The book said it was around 9 p.m. on December 31st, but that wasn't the part that made her sit up, her heart beating a little faster. It was the next part. The book stated that all of recorded human history, every pyramid, every empire, every invention, every story ever written, all of it, had taken place in the last 60 seconds of this entire year. The last 60 seconds. Ilara put the book down. She leaned back against her pillows, the words echoing in the quiet room. 60 seconds, all the pressure she felt to build a legacy, to make her mark, to have her life perfectly figured out by a certain age. It all happened within the last minute of a year that had lasted for 4.6 billion years. The thought was so enormous it was dizzying. It didn't make her life feel meaningless. It did the opposite. It made the pressure feel meaningless. The friend with the promotion, the friend buying the house, her own worries about her career path, they were all happening within the same fleeting, final minute of December 31st. There was no behind. On the scale of deep time, everyone was and always would be a brand new arrival. She looked at the clock. It was 11:15 p.m. In 45 minutes, a new day would begin. But on the Earth's calendar, a new second would take a lifetime. A profound sense of relief washed over her, so powerful it felt like a physical weight being lifted from her chest. The tight schedule she had been holding herself to, the frantic race against an invisible clock, it all just evaporated. She wasn't wasting time. She was living in it. Just like the continents, she was moving at exactly the right speed for a human life. There was no rush. The planet itself had taken its sweet time, and it had turned out beautifully. She turned off the light and lay down in the darkness, a small, genuine smile on her face. She didn't need to count sheep or control her breathing. She just let her mind drift into the deep, dark, comfortable silence of geologic time. She pictured the long, quiet eons before she existed. The slow formation of the oceans, the patient drifting of the continents, the rise and fall of countless species. It was a history of immense patience. There was no hurry then, and there didn't need to be one now. The deep time wasn't a scary emptiness. It was a lullaby, a quiet song that had been playing for billions of years, reminding her that her small, precious 60-second life was exactly that. Precious. It was not meant to be spent in a panic about timelines, but to be lived one slow, calm breath at a time. And as the deep time settled over her, Alara fell into a sleep so peaceful and deep, it felt as ancient as the rocks themselves. Alara's new understanding of time had changed her. She walked through her days with a new kind of patience. The small frustrations, a long line at the coffee shop, a traffic jam, a tedious task at work, simply didn't hook her the way they used to. When measured against billions of years, a 5-minute delay was less than a blink. But life, she was learning, is a balance of the vast and the intimate. While her mind was comfortable with deep time, her heart sometimes felt adrift in all that emptiness. The feeling was hard to describe. It wasn't sadness and it wasn't loneliness in the usual sense. It was more like a feeling of being unmoored, a tiny boat on a very large, dark sea. It surfaced one Saturday afternoon. She had gone for a walk in a park by a large lake. The water was calm, reflecting the gray of the overcast sky. She sat on a bench, watching the waves gently lap at the shore. It was peaceful, but the vast, flat expanse of water made her feel that strange, quiet isolation again. The world was so big, and her place in it felt so small and temporary. She thought about the deep time, and for the first time, it felt a little cold. The billions of years before her didn't care about her. The billions of years after would not remember her. It was a true thought, but not a comforting one in that moment. She pulled out her phone, not for social media, but to look up something she had seen in the library book's index: ocean currents. She remembered a brief mention of something called the global conveyor belt. The name sounded like something from a factory, not from nature. She started reading an article about it. At first, it was just facts. The global conveyor belt, also known as thermohaline circulation, is a system of deep ocean currents driven by temperature and salinity. It was a complicated idea. But as she read on, sitting there by the lake, the facts began to form a picture in her mind. She learned that this conveyor belt is a massive planet-wide loop. It begins in the cold polar regions like the North Atlantic. There, the surface water becomes very cold and salty. This makes it denser, so dense that it sinks. It sinks all the way down to the very bottom of the ocean, into the deep, dark abyss. This sinking water starts a journey. A slow, deep river begins to flow along the ocean floor. This river of cold water travels south through the Atlantic, around the tip of Africa, and into the vastness of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. The journey is incredibly slow, moving at a pace of just a few centimeters per second. The article said it can take a single parcel of water 1,000 years to complete one full loop. 1,000 years. The number landed in her heart differently than the billions of years had. 1,000 years was still unimaginably long, but it was a journey. It had a path. It had a purpose. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine it. She pictured the cold, dense water sinking in the far north like a deep, slow breath in. She followed it in her mind, this silent, invisible river flowing in the perpetual darkness of the deep sea. It was carrying cold water and nutrients from one part of the world to another. Then, in other parts of the world, this deep water eventually wells up, rising slowly back to the surface. It brings those nutrients from the depths, feeding the tiny plants called phytoplankton, which in turn feed the entire ocean food web. The rising water was like the Earth's slow, steady exhale. This wasn't just a current. It was the planet's circulatory system, its pulse. And this pulse had been beating for thousands of years, long before she was born, and it would continue for thousands more after she was gone. It was a constant. It was reliable. The feeling of being adrift began to fade, replaced by a new sensation: connection. She wasn't a separate boat on a vast sea. She was living on the land that this deep, watery pulse flowed around. The same system that circulated the ocean's water was connected to the air she breathed, the rain that fell, the very climate that made her life possible. Her small life was happening on the surface, while beneath the waves, a timeless, steady heartbeat continued, completely indifferent to her daily worries, yet utterly essential to her existence. It didn't need her to be aware of it to do its job. It just was, the thought was deeply comforting. She didn't need to feel important to the planet to feel peaceful. She could take solace in its constant, reliable rhythms. She could lean into its stability. A light rain began to fall, dotting the surface of the lake with tiny circles. Instead of getting up to leave, Alara just pulled her hood up. She watched the rain meet the water, and she thought about the cycle. The water evaporates, forms clouds, falls as rain, flows into rivers, and returns to the ocean, where the great conveyor belt would eventually take it on a millennium-long journey. She was part of that cycle, too. Every breath she took, every drop of water she drank, was part of this ancient looping dance. She stood up from the bench and started walking home. The rain was cool on her face, but she didn't mind. The feeling of isolation was gone. The world felt big but not empty. It was full of these slow, powerful, nurturing systems. The deep time was the stage, and the ocean's pulse was the rhythm. That night, as she lay in bed, she didn't think about rocks or continents. She listened to the quiet of her room and imagined she could hear, in the silence, the faint, imagined echo of that deep, cold, constant river flowing on in the dark, connecting all the world's oceans into one single breathing entity. It was the most peaceful sound she had never heard. Alara's journey had taken her from the slow drift of continents to the deep pulse of the oceans. She had found peace in the vast scales of time and space. But a new, quieter question began to form in her mind. If the world was so big and so old, what did that make her? Was she just a temporary visitor, a brief flicker in the long, dark night of geologic time? The thought wasn't scary, but it was lonely. She found herself thinking about this one evening while cleaning her apartment. Dust. It was the eternal enemy of every clean home. She wiped a cloth along the top of a bookshelf, and it came away gray. She sighed. It felt like a pointless battle. No matter how much she cleaned, the dust always came back. She looked at the dust clinging to her cloth. For the first time, she didn't just see dirt. She saw tiny particles. What was it made of? She remembered reading that house dust was a mix of things: flakes of dead skin, fibers from clothes and carpets, and pollen from plants. But there was something else, too. Something from outside. Curious, she abandoned her cleaning and picked up her laptop. She started searching, falling down a rabbit hole of information about dust. She learned about a different kind of dust, one that was always falling from the sky. It was called cosmic dust, or atmospheric dust, and its story was incredible. She read that every single day, anywhere from 30 to 100 tons of cosmic dust falls to Earth from space. Tiny particles from comets and asteroids, burning up in the atmosphere and sifting down as a fine, invisible powder. This dust contained minerals that were older than the Earth itself. But that wasn't the part that made her stop and stare at the screen, her cleaning completely forgotten. She read about the very air she breathed. The article explained that the Earth's atmosphere is a dynamic mixing soup. The molecules of gas, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, are constantly moving and colliding and spreading across the entire planet. And then came the sentence that changed everything for her. Statistically, with every breath you take, you are inhaling molecules that were once breathed by every person who ever lived. Alara leaned back in her chair, the words hitting her with a physical force. She looked at the dusty cloth on her table. She looked at the air in her sunlit room. It wasn't empty. It was a living museum. A shared inheritance. She took a slow, deliberate breath. She wasn't just breathing oxygen. She was breathing the same air as Leonardo da Vinci when he painted the Mona Lisa. She was sharing a molecule with the first human who ever kindled a fire. She was connected to every dinosaur that ever roamed, every flower that ever bloomed, every sailor who ever sang a song under the stars. The air in her lungs had been inside the lungs of kings and queens, of poets and farmers, of mothers and children for thousands of generations. It had been part of the battle cries of ancient warriors and the whispered prayers of people in quiet temples. The feeling of loneliness didn't just vanish. It was replaced by its opposite, a feeling of profound, unbreakable connection. She thought about her own life, the people she had loved and lost. Her grandfather, who had taught her how to whittle a piece of wood, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners when he smiled. Was it possible that a molecule of air he had exhaled decades ago was now, by the chaotic, beautiful dance of the wind, right here in this room? That she was, in a literal physical way, still sharing the same space with him. The idea was so beautiful it brought tears to her eyes. She looked at the dust on her bookshelf again. It wasn't just a nuisance anymore. It was stardust. It was history. It was the dust of ancient worlds, both celestial and human, settling gently around her, reminding her that she belonged to a continuous, unbroken story. She got up and walked to the window, opening it wide. The cool evening air flowed in. She took a deep, deep breath, filling her lungs completely. She wasn't a separate, temporary flicker. She was a note in a long, unending song. The air was the proof. It was the thread that connected her to everything that had ever lived. The dinosaurs, the Roman emperors, the builders of the pyramids, her own ancestors, they were all gone. But the air they breathed was still here. It was recycling itself, over and over, giving life again and again. That night, as she got ready for bed, she didn't feel small. She felt woven into the fabric of the planet. The deep time was the length of the fabric, and the shared air was the thread that held it all together. She lay down and closed her eyes. Instead of focusing on the silence, she focused on her breath. In and out. With each inhale, she imagined she was drawing in courage from a long-forgotten explorer, creativity from an ancient artist, peace from a quiet monk. With each exhale, she was releasing her own story back into the world, a gift for the future, for someone else to unknowingly breathe in. 1,000 years from now, her breath was no longer just a function of her body. It was a conversation with history. It was the most intimate connection imaginable, and it had been there all along in every single moment of her life. She just hadn't known to listen. Now, it was the only lullaby she would ever need. Elara's world had become a place of beautiful, tangible connections. She felt the ancient rocks beneath her feet, breathed the shared air of history, and was comforted by the slow, deep pulse of the ocean. Her sleep was now a peaceful harbor, not a battleground, but one last mystery called to her, something invisible, something she had never once stopped to consider. It started with a news segment she saw in a coffee shop. The television was muted, but the images were dramatic. The screen showed the sun, and then a brilliant eruption on its surface. A graphic illustrated a wave of energy, called a solar storm, shooting out towards a tiny blue Earth. The next image was of the night sky, but not the one she knew. It was filled with shimmering green and pink curtains of light, the aurora borealis, more vibrant and widespread than usual. The caption on the screen read, "Solar storm bombards Earth." Auroras seen as far south as Florida. A man sitting near her shook his head and said to his friend, "Scary stuff. That could knock out our power grids, you know. Wipe out all the satellites." For a moment, a flicker of the old anxiety returned. A wave of energy from the sun, powerful enough to destroy the technology her entire life depended on. It sounded like a science fiction disaster movie. It was a threat from space, something completely beyond anyone's control. That evening, the thought stayed with her. The sun was a constant, but it was also a tempestuous star. What was stopping these solar storms from stripping away our atmosphere or frying the planet with radiation? It felt like a cosmic game of roulette, and we were just lucky every day it didn't happen. She sat with her laptop, the library book feeling insufficient for this new question. She typed in, "Solar storm protection Earth." What she discovered left her speechless. She learned that the Earth has a force field. It wasn't made of metal or energy beams like in the movies. It was a magnetic field, generated by the churning liquid iron in the planet's core, over 1,000 miles beneath the surface. This magnetic field extends far out into space, creating an invisible bubble around the Earth called the magnetosphere. The articles and videos explained it like this. The solar storm, a torrent of charged particles rushing from the sun at 1,000,000 miles per hour, is called the solar wind. When this wind hits Earth's magnetosphere, it doesn't hit the planet directly. Instead, the magnetic field catches it, shapes it, and deflects it. funneling most of those dangerous particles harmlessly around the planet and off into space. The beautiful auroras she saw in the news footage. That was the tiny fraction of particles that were guided by the magnetic field towards the North and South poles, where they safely interacted with the upper atmosphere, creating a spectacular light show. The disaster was being transformed into beauty. The magnetosphere was a shield, a silent, constant, vigilant guardian. Alara got up and walked to her window. She looked up at the night sky. It looked calm and empty, but she now knew that just beyond the blue, an epic, invisible battle was taking place. A storm of cosmic proportions was constantly raging from the sun, and an ancient, powerful force generated from the very heart of her world was standing guard, protecting everything on it. She placed a hand on her own chest, feeling the steady, simple beat of her own heart. And deep below, she imagined the planet's fiery iron heart, spinning and churning, generating this immense protective embrace for every single living thing. This was the final piece of the puzzle. The rocks were the bones of the earth. The oceans were its blood. The air was its breath. And the magnetic field was its soul, an invisible, powerful spirit that reached out into the void to keep its children safe. All the fears she had ever had, of not being safe, of the world being a dangerous and unpredictable place, melted away in the face of this truth. She had always been safe. She had always been protected. Not by a person, or a government, or a locked door, but by the planet itself. The man in the coffee shop was right to be amazed by the power of the solar storm. But he had missed the real miracle. The real miracle was the shield. That night, as she lay in bed, she didn't feel like a separate person on a planet. She felt like she was within something. She was inside a protective bubble, a celestial cradle that had rocked life to sleep for billions of years. She thought about all the other nights she had lain awake, her mind racing with fears of job security, social embarrassments, and personal failures. Those fears were real, but they were small storms. And just as the magnetosphere handled the solar wind, she now had her own inner guardians, the deep time, the shared air, the patient rocks, to help shape and deflect those anxieties, to keep her core self safe. She closed her eyes, visualizing that gentle, powerful magnetic field surrounding her, flowing through her, connecting her to the living heart of the world. It was the ultimate security blanket, one she never had to ask for, one that never wore out. It was just there. It had always been there. And it always would be. The change in Alara was not something you could see in a photograph. It wasn't a new haircut or a different style of clothes. It was something quieter, something that lived in the calm space between her heartbeats, in the easy rhythm of her breath. One evening, a few months after her journey began, a problem arose at work. It was a genuine, stressful situation. A client was unhappy, a deadline was moved up, and the team had to stay late. The old office atmosphere of panicked voices and tense shoulders returned. Alara felt the familiar pressure, the quickening of her pulse. For a moment, the ghost of her old anxiety tapped her on the shoulder. But instead of pulling her under, she simply acknowledged it. "Hello," she thought to the feeling. "I see you're here." She excused herself, walked to the break room, and poured a glass of cold water. She stood by the window, looking out at the city lights starting to twinkle in the early evening. She didn't try to fight the stress or tell herself it wasn't real. Instead, she did something new. She placed the problem on the map of her new world. She thought about the problem not as a world-ending catastrophe, but as a small, temporary weather system, a personal thunderstorm. And she knew from her nights of reading that at any given moment there were 2,000 other storms happening. This was just one. It would release its energy and pass. She thought about the deep time. This frantic evening, this difficult week, was less than a second on the Earth's long calendar. It would not define her story. She felt the solid floor beneath her feet and remembered the continental plate it was part of, drifting slowly and powerfully to the west. Her problem felt frantic and rushed, but the ground she stood on was moving with an ancient, unshakable patience. She could borrow a little of that. By the time she walked back to her desk, the panic had receded. It was still a difficult situation, but she was no longer drowning in it. She was navigating it, steady as a continent, calm as deep ocean water. Her colleagues noticed her quiet focus, and slowly the energy in the room began to settle around her calmness. Later that night at home, she was tired. It was the good, honest tiredness of a day's work done, She went through her bedtime routine, washing her face, brushing her teeth, and there was no dread in the actions. The bedroom was not a chamber of struggle anymore. It was a place of rest. She didn't need to pick up the library book. Its truths were now written inside her. She turned off the light and lay down in the darkness. The ceiling was just a ceiling again. It was not a screen for her fears, but simply the top of her room, a boundary between her and the night sky. She closed her eyes. She didn't force her mind to be blank. Instead, she let it wander through the peaceful landscapes she had discovered. She pictured the Atlantic Ocean, widening at the speed her fingernails grew. She saw the rock cycle, the endless patient transformation from sand to stone and back again. She felt the immense comforting weight of deep time, making her life feel not small, but precious. She listened for the silent, deep ocean current, the planet's steady pulse that had been beating for millennia. She took a deep breath, imagining she was sharing the air with every storyteller, every parent, every dreamer who had ever lived. And finally, she felt the embrace of the magnetic field, the silent guardian born from the Earth's fiery heart, keeping her safe from the storms of space. These were not separate facts in a textbook. They were a symphony, a slow, beautiful, and powerful lullaby that the Earth had been singing since the beginning. Her body relaxed into the mattress. Her breathing became slow and deep, matching the rhythm of the planet she now understood so intimately. The day's stress was just a layer of sediment, already settling at the bottom of her ocean, soon to be transformed into something new and strong. Ilara was no longer a woman trying to fall asleep. She was a woman being lulled to sleep. She was resting within a living world, a world that was ancient and patient, powerful and protective, and endlessly renewing. She had gone looking for a way to quiet her mind, and she had found a universe of peace. She had learned the most relaxing fact of all, that she was home, and in that deep, quiet knowing, sleep came to her not as a victory, but as a welcome guest. It wrapped around her as gently and as surely as the Earth's own magnetic field, and she drifted into a dreamless, perfect rest, cradled in the arms of the world.